Have strikes brought the country to a standstill? Are Windrush victims being betrayed? And will Jeremy Corbyn be mentioned at Prime Minister's Questions? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Bob Seely, Labour MP Zara Sultana, The Guardian's Aubrey Allegretti and former Conservative political advisor Anita Boateng. Today,
teachers have seen a long-term and very severe cut in their pay in real terms, and that's been accompanied by a huge increase in workload.
The most important thing for us to do as the government is to halve inflation, is to get inflation down so that everybody feels better off.
Hundreds of thousands of teachers, train drivers and civil servants out on strike. Who will blink first, the government or the unions?
They've made the promises, but then they're taking back the promises. And it seems to be something that's just happening to the Windrush victims time and time again.
Why victims of the Windrush scandal say they're being betrayed by government.
The way we vote is changing.
You'll need ID to vote in May's elections. Will people be turned away?
I would just gently remind him he thought the member for Islington North was the right person to look after our security. Why it was a few years ago. He was supporting the member for Islington North. For 4 long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North.
Why does Rishi Sunak so often refer to the former Labour leader at Prime Minister's Questions? And we'll bring you today's question and answer session live at noon. So hundreds of thousands of workers are taking part in what's probably the biggest day of strike action in decades. Teachers and train drivers are among them. Let's have a look at some of the front pages, starting with the Daily Telegraph. Teachers in walkout could still be paid, is their headline. In The Guardian, it's 500,000 to strike as unions warn talks are going backwards. And in The Mail, their headline is a cynical walkout that betrays our children again. We asked the question, or posed it at least in the headlines. I'll put it to the panel now, starting with you, Bob. Who is going to blink first in this dispute, the government or the unions?
I'm not going to put it in terms of such confrontational terms. I think it's unhelpful. I think what the government needs to do...
Isn't it a reality?
What the government needs to do is bring down inflation, as Gillian said. It needs to bring down inflation for everybody. And so we can't have inflation-busting pay rises. When it comes to education and schools specifically, the facts are these. If you're an experienced teacher, the pay offer is 5%. If you are a new teacher, the pay offer is very near the level of inflation at 8.9%. There's also progression pay rises, which could help another 40% of teachers.
So they should just accept it?
Well, we need to get inflation down for everybody. We've promised to get it down, halve it this year, and after that we need to get it down further, because as Gillian says, getting inflation down makes everybody better off and it becomes less painful for everybody.
Zara?
So that's what we need to do.
Zara?
Well, I was at an NEU picket this morning and the teachers there don't want to be on strike. They want to be teaching kids, and them going on strike is a very difficult decision, but they haven't seen their pay increase. It's 13% less than it was when the Tories came into power. With increasing workloads, tension and stress, there's so much pressure on teachers and so many are choosing to leave the profession. So this is a measure of last resort, and they're having to do this because negotiations and conversations with the government haven't succeeded thus far.
Aubrey, who is going to blink first? Bob says that's confrontational, but that is the reality here. There's very little movement on either side.
Well, absolutely. The government is trying to paint this as an argument that says there can be no exceptions, that all public sector workers have to accept the Independent Pay Review Body recommendations. Now, they are, of course, picking a rather brave political fight because there are some Conservative MPs who feel that there should have been an exception made for health workers, and that hasn't happened. Now, the progress that we've heard about doesn't seem to be happening. The government indicated there might be some wiggle room for manoeuvre on pay if there was progress on efficiency savings. But that stonewalling, again, is creating more bad blood between the unions and the government.
is the government going to continue to resist the pressure that's being put upon them on a day of action like this?
I think it's a very different proposition to have teachers striking, because that does impact a lot of the workforce, because you have a lot of people that have to stay at home to look after their children. So I think this is one of the first strikes that will be felt very widely across the economy. It's maybe not, it's not going to be revolutionary because a lot of people work from home now. But in terms of the question of how we end up getting out of this situation, I think that looking forward to the next pay settlement seems to be a place where the government is willing to kind of show more flexibility. I think we might end up in a bit of a logjam if we continue with the kind of current stasis that's happening. I think ultimately pupils are really suffering. They've gone through a really tumultuous time. I completely accept and agree with Zara, actually, that teachers have gone through a very difficult time too. It just feels that when you look at the economic situation the government faces and the need to get rid of the backlogs in education as well as in the health system, there isn't a lot of flexibility the government can really show there.
Do you think there should be a special case for teachers?
Well, the average teacher, again, let's look at teachers and the train drivers, because Anita makes a good point. The average teacher earns just shy of £40,000. So they're actually a lot better off. The average teacher earns nearly £40,000. So they're a lot better off than a lot of the parents of the kids they teach. The average train driver earns, depending on overtime, between 60 and 100,000. And actually, at the next election, there's going to be, the politics of this, at the next election, there's going to be a simple choice, that we, on the side of the workers, we want people to get to work. We're bringing in minimum service levels, which will be scrapped by the Labour Party. And the Labour Party have taken 125 million from the unions in the last 10 years. So, of course, they're going to do the unions' bidding.
Trade union donations are the cleanest money in politics, and if every Tory MP declared their second jobs, donations from oil and gas, billionaires and all sorts of other vested interests, I don't think we'd get through many debates in Parliament if they were just declaring their interests. On the point about minimum service levels, if this government truly cared about safety, you'd think they'd mention it at least once in the bill. It doesn't get mentioned even once. It gives wide-ranging powers to the Secretary of State, who will define what minimum safety levels are, which is incredibly authoritarian. And also, if this was a measure to solve the current disputes, it's not going to. It's making the situation worse. And if this government cared about minimum service levels, they should have them on non-strike days. In the NHS, there are already chronic shortages in beds, in staffing. If we look across the public sector, that is the case. In schools, there are shortages. Rather than address those fundamental issues, this is about fighting with the unions, because I guess the government doesn't like strong unions fighting for their workers and advocating for their interests.
Bob?
Sorry, Zara. I mean, we would love folks to be working, and the idea that we go around picking battles with the unions is nonsense.
This is exactly what's happening.
But we need to have minimum service levels. If it's such a draconian measure, why does France have it? Why does Germany have it?
We have stronger unions. We have some of the most restrictive
anti-union
legislation in the Western world, and this will make it even worse.
They have unions that work with governments, work with industries in a way that some of the more left-wing unions in this country simply don't want. They want to be divisive.
So, Bob, why doesn't Bright Chaps want to meet with RMT and other unions to resolve these disputes? Why are the government
government ministers have met with unions, but actually it's the train companies responsible for striking the contracts and striking the deals. But I come back to this central point. We're on the side of the workers. You're not.
That's 125.
You've taken 125 million from the unions.
I have not personally taken 125 million
MPs, Labour MPs, constituency associations and the Labour Party have taken 125 million
and how much
from the
has the Conservative Party taken from oil and gas, from billionaires, from landlords and property developers and all sorts of other damaging interests?
Your policies are paid for by the unions. That's why you are opposing. That's why, Zara, you're opposing the minimum strikes.
Very clean
and at the next election, you'll be saying you'll be withdrawing this bill, and we'll be saying we need to get this bill in because it's a bill like the French have, like the Germans have, to make sure there are minimum service
little in common with Jacob Rees-Mogg, but even he said the bill...
But fair point. I'll give you that much.
We'll be talking to Mick Whelan, who's the General Secretary of ASLEF, the train drivers' union that has been mentioned in this discussion after Prime Minister's questions, so around 12:30. Let's move on. Let me show you this headline in The Independent. Lib Dem peer Fluella Benjamin hits out at government's disrespect of Windrush generation. This is in response to a U-turn on key reform pledges that were made by the government. Initially, the government adopted all 30 of the proposals in the report that was carried out by Wendy Williams, but has now backtracked on 3 of them. That's to establish a Migrants Commissioner, to increase the powers of the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, and hold reconciliation events. Is that the right decision, Bob?
OK, I didn't, because I'm needed to find out more about this. I spoke to the Home Office SPADs this morning.
Special advisors.
Sorry, I do apologise. We don't want to use acronyms for special advisors. And what they say is that out of the 30 recommendations made, 21 were effectively dealt with by last March. 60, and so we're working on another 9 that were still outstanding. Let me just make the point. £64 million has been paid out in compensation. When it comes to those 3 issues, the civil servants' advice, it's not a political... The politicians aren't doing this off their own bat. The officials' advice, the advice from the civil servants, is that the 3 items, including reconciliation events, are not necessarily best done by government, although some 200 such events have already taken place.
Although, interestingly, the government did accept everything at the beginning.
It did, but it's now, based on the civil servants' own advice, those 3 items are best dealt with by by bits apart from the government.
Do you accept that as a justification?
No, because the Windrush scandal was a shocking injustice to people who lost their homes, jobs, some were deported, some people died before any kind of justice took place for them. And there are issues also with the compensation scheme. There are more people who have been rejected than payments that have been paid out to them. And then when we look at the government, when it deals with scandals like this, it apologises, says it's going to look into recommendations and implement them, and then turns around and doesn't do that. The same with the second job scandal and even with Grenfell as well.
Right, well, I mean, just sticking with this, is this a bit of an own goal by the Home Office?
Well, I think when I remember reading the 30 recommendations from Wendy Williams when they came out, and I've got to say the reconciliation events was the one that I kind of went, ooh, those will need to be handled carefully, because I think that sometimes...
But does that mean they're wrong?
Well, community outreach is really important, and it seems from the written statement from the Home Secretary that there have been a lot of these community engagement events. I just think they need to be carefully done. So I can see a world in which you may end up not doing those in the exact same form as recommended, but you bring something that keeps the spirit of that. The question, though, of external scrutiny is the other 2 recommendations, where I think perhaps, I mean, it's always challenging when you have and you create these new bodies or with increased powers to scrutinise, but that may end up serving and adding to some element of integrity. So I'll be interested to see how the Home Office kind of navigates that question, where I think there is probably more questions.
I mean, there is a sense of betrayal. We heard it there in the headlines from someone who suffered as a result of the scandal, you know, British residents perhaps being threatened with deportation. Is that overplayed, then, the sense of betrayal?
Well, I think what Bob was talking about was very interesting. If there are perfectly reasonable reasons why in the last few years the advice has changed from officials about why to do this...
Last few months.
Then it would be more helpful to explain why that change has taken place, because it's not a case of just kind of the Home Office making a decision. You need to bring people with you and realise the damage that was done, explain that so that they still have confidence, even though these recommendations they were told were coming into effect aren't.
I completely agree. Look, I agree absolutely with Zara says. This is an awful series of events, and actually really shameful. Government has committed to putting it right. By last March, we had already fulfilled 2/3 of the recommendations. We were working on the last 9. You're absolutely right, Anita, about the reconciliation. Actually, if government was doing the reconciliation itself, you can guarantee people would say they don't trust the process because it's being handled by the Home Office, so they would want somebody independent doing it. So actually, a lot of this is being on those 3 changes, which have happened in the last few months, Aubrey, then I think it's very understandable why this is being done, and it's probably being done to give it greater credibility. This is why I got on the phone this morning before coming on the programme, because I wanted to know for myself why we were not putting in those 3. So it's not a question of reneging on them. Actually, there are better ways of achieving a reconciliation process, and there have already been 200 outreach meetings, so it's not as if none have happened.
Well, do you accept that things might have changed, that this might be a more productive way of actually meeting some of the commitments that are being made?
I think it's really important to centre the victims of the scandal, and like the interview we heard, where they're not happy happy with what is happening through the Home Office, I think it's important to platform those and listen to those concerns and move forward with the Home Office listening to those.
But Zara, if the Home Office ran the reconciliation meetings themselves, I can well imagine, with the best will in the world, you will turn around and say the Home Office shouldn't be doing that because the Home Office was part of the problem. So what we're trying to do is say, actually, the Home Office may not be the best person, that actually independent groups, NGOs, may be a better bet to lead a process that's got credibility. So that, for me, that's what I'm reading into this decision. Anyway.
But what about the external scrutiny, as Anita sees it? Why are those two being involved?
I don't know. I mean, I tried to get as much steer and information from the Home Office this morning, and I focused on the reconciliation stuff because that seemed to be absolutely the most important, because that was a very public-facing aspect, that people need to have their stories heard, they need to be listened to, and actually, for me, probably the Home Office, because it was part of the problem, is not necessarily the organisation that should be leading this process.
All right. When voters in England and Wales go to the polls in the May elections this year, they're going to be required for the first time to bring proof of ID. The Electoral Commission has been pushing an information campaign to make sure that voters are actually aware of the new requirement. However, this headline in The Guardian underlines a potential issue. Only 10,000 people in Great Britain have applied for government-issued voter ID. We can have a look here also at the list of ID that will be acceptable. You can see the long list there. People will need that, otherwise they will be turned away when they come to vote. Why do we need this, Bob, particularly? I mean, what's the evidence of widespread electoral fraud?
Well, I think there's a very, very simple principle behind this, and it's one that personally, Joe, I completely support, that if you're going to vote, voting is one of the most important things that we do in this country.
Yes.
And to make sure our system remains clean and remains credible, it is perfectly acceptable to ask people to produce ID when voting. In the same way that if you look young enough, and sadly those days are past for me, if you're going to go and have a drink and you go into the pub and you may be asked for proof of age, you take ID to a pub. You take ID when you're going abroad.
It's a perfectly reasonable move.
By the government's own declarations, only 6 cases of electoral ballot fraud took place at the last general election. So this...
Provable.
This policy is incredibly harmful for nearly 2 million people who don't possess photo ID, while the government has introduced measures. Less than 0.5% of the people that need photo ID have got that voluntary ID certification. And if we look at the list of ID that's acceptable, there's discrepancies between an Oyster card for someone who's over 60 and a young person's Oyster card. If we look at an older person's bus pass, but not a young person's bus pass and rail pass. So there seems to be unfairness in the way some of this identification will be acceptable. But also, this is straight out of the Republicans' handbook from the US. It makes it harder to vote, and it's the people who are already underrepresented who are going to be disproportionately hit by this.
Do you agree with that, Anita?
No, and I think the politicisation of this issue just honestly is really damaging to politics in general. The fundamental situation is that if we take a long-term view, it's probably better for our electoral system that there is some kind of rigour around the process of voting. We use ID when we go to collect a parcel. In Northern Ireland, they've had it for about 20 years. Like, there are very reasonable things that you could see in the long term would benefit and add to the integrity of our electoral system. That's not about saying the system is currently rife with fraud. It's just saying, in general, it would be better. You've got to do it in a way that is careful, and you've got to do it in a way that allows people to adjust and adapt. And I do think that ultimately, when we talk about and we politicise this issue, we're not talking about Northern Ireland. We always talk about the US, which has an entirely different electoral system. And I really think that it fundamentally destroys trust in our electoral system. And I think that the measures the government have put in place around this have been fairly careful, and I think it's going to move us in a direction that our politics in general should go.
Aubrey?
Well, the argument is that the government is moving too quickly on this, and it's not bringing people with them quickly enough, because obviously the local elections are in May. There's only been 0.5% of people who don't have this kind of ID who've said to have got it in the past 2 weeks. That, at the current rate, we're told it will take about 8 years for the number of people who haven't got it to get it.
But the problem with that argument, I mean, as ever, I think Anita summed it up incredibly eloquently. But when it comes to, if we didn't have it for this election, everyone would say, oh, you bring it in for the general election, why haven't you brought it in beforehand? We're trying to bring it in for this election now to make sure that the process actually works like it should. And actually, agree with Anita. The politicisation of this is really unnecessary. Nobody thinks that having ID in Northern Ireland is somehow disruptive to democracy there. And actually, we don't know, Zara, just on the point of fraud, we don't know how much fraud takes place in the system, because just because only 6 people have been prosecuted, it doesn't mean that there are a small number of additional cases or many hundreds of thousands. We simply don't know.
You both put this allegation of politicising this. Is that what's happening?
I believe that the government has politicised this issue because there isn't evidence for this kind of policy. And instead, when we look at who's going to be impacted, the data shows that these are people who will probably vote for the Labour Party. So what we see with the government is just by hook or crook trying to hold on to power. And we see with the whole raft of policies that they've brought through, that's exactly what they're doing.
I mean, is that the risk? You're going to disenfranchise the sorts of people, groups of people who might vote
Has
Labour.
that happened in Northern Ireland?
That was going to be my question. So I mean, what we've got to do is absolutely make sure that everyone who wants to vote can vote and they can participate in the process. And what you're going to, we've done pilots around this that has been tested, and a lot of people, for instance, go home and collect ID. A lot of people voting for the first time are quite surprised that they don't need to bring anything with them. I do think that ultimately we've got the elections coming up quickly. We need to make sure people are aware of this. People will adjust, and I think it will happen fairly quickly. And maybe I'm not surprised to hear that people aren't all, sadly, watching programmes like this to know that this is coming in.
A lot of people are, Anita.
But I think they will adjust when it comes to that first election, and we will see a ground shift. And this conversation that helps people to believe there's some kind of conspiracy against them voting really damages trust in politics. And I think that is disenfranchising, not this.
Has Anita convinced you?
No, absolutely not. Further to the points I was making was that local councils just haven't been given the support and the advice to be able to implement this in time.
I got a letter from my local council today saying we're checking who's registered to vote. They're doing it at the moment.
I mean, the thing is your sort of objection, if I can call it that, Aubrey, a practical one rather than a political one? I mean, is there a risk that there'll be a lot of young people who perhaps don't get their ID in time or bring it to the ballot box, to the voting booth?
I think that's been a concern raised by the Electoral Commission itself, that essentially this is all being quite rushed and they can't guarantee how well the election will be able to be run in May. And obviously we've talked about the fact that, people are not exactly completely hooked. It's hard enough to get people to register to vote, let alone to then kind of get them to register to have the right ID for it. So there will come a point much closer to polling day probably where there's a big scramble, and then we see the sort of calculation about how many people do we think that this is going to sort of tighten up the rules and regulations around how many fewer instances of voter fraud might there be versus how many people are turned away from polling stations. Is that number really going to be smaller?
I mean, are you going to call for it to be postponed, this move, or scrapped altogether?
I'd like it to be scrapped entirely. I would want us to have a system where it's easy to vote, where more people are able to vote and more people want to vote, and I feel like this will only make it harder.
I mean, that is the point. You do want as many people to vote as possible, don't you?
Yeah, you do, for sure, and that's why we need to advertise what we're doing to make sure people are aware. But you also need you need integrity in the system, and as Anita says, actually, every time I turn up to vote, I'm surprised that people don't ask for any ID. You could turn up and say, give whatever name you wanted. And OK, if they've already voted, you're going to have a problem explaining yourself. But if you go early enough, you could literally choose to be any person, and you don't have to have identification. It seems bizarre that we've had a system which is so sort of trusting for so long, and actually just having basic ID with you. As Anita said, you have ID when you're picking up a parcel. That is not as important as voting. You have ID when you go to the pub. Yeah, that is not as important as voting. You probably take your driving licence when you're driving. Not all the time. I don't. I hope that's. Is that the law?
Let's not discuss your personal idea where you failed to.
Zara makes the point about making it easier to vote. I don't think it's difficult to vote now, and I think it's right. I think we absolutely need to move to a system where more people are confident about the process and have their ID. And I think there's never going to be a perfect time to do this. But I do think, on balance, if we bite the bullet and do this now, it will help improve the integrity of our system and trust in our system in the next couple of decades. And I think that is worth doing.
Right.
I think what we've seen in Northern Ireland, if we look at the data, trust in the integrity of the process, obviously there was a very different context in which it was brought in, but the trust in the integrity of the process is pretty high now as a result of that. So I think it is an important measure in the long view.
Let's talk about Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party. He hasn't been in that position since 2020, but he does crop up rather a lot in political debate, and particularly at Prime Minister's questions. Let's have a listen.
Mr. Speaker, the difference between him and me is that I stand by my values and my principles, even when it is difficult. When I disagreed fundamentally with the previous Prime Minister, I resigned from the government. But for four long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North. When anti-Semitism ran rife, when his predecessor sided with our opponents, that's what's weak, Mr. Speaker. He has no principles and just petty politics.
Well, that was Rishi Sunak, and we'll hear from him again in about 20 minutes' time for Prime Minister's Questions today. We're joined now by Joe Twyman from Delta pollster. Joe, is this sort of line of attack from the Prime Minister working?
Well, the fact that Labour are, in some polls, more than 20 points ahead suggests it's probably not. But at the same time, you can, from a certain point of view, understand why the Conservatives are pushing this. In the words of the great philosopher John Bon Jovi, you live for that fight when it's all that you've got. There is a lot of evidence to show that Labour are consistently ahead when it comes to all of the major issues when given the choice between Labour and Conservatives. And so what can you go for? Well, you can go for the historical damage that Jeremy Corbyn did to the popularity of Labour and his performance at the last election, and you can try and tie Keir Starmer to that. The difficulty is that it doesn't really wash with voters. Nearly two-thirds of Labour voters believe that Jeremy Corbyn is not as good as Keir Starmer. They believe that Keir Starmer is better. Only around about 1 in 10 believe that it's Jeremy Corbyn who is the better leader of the two. And so this is an attempt, I think, to as I say, tie Keir Starmer to an unpopular figure who remains unpopular in the country as a whole. But at the same time, I think it's an attempt to create a sort of division and perhaps a sign of disunity within Labour, and perhaps to poke certain sections of the party in the hope that they will respond in a way that is helpful to the Conservatives.
Bob, it's not working.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, and I do think it's important to remind people. And I think there's a very simple principle here, that Keir Starmer stood alongside and supported Jeremy Corbyn's leadership when Jeremy Corbyn was anti-NATO, was making excuses for Putin's poisoning in Salisbury, when Corbyn was coming out with a whole host of hard-left Marxist policies, including being almost pro-Brexit. I mean, it's one sensible thing he's come out with. So, and I do think it's useful to remind people of that Starmer was very happy to sit with this Marxist former leader of the Labour Party. So it's very difficult for Starmer to say now, oh, I'm pro-NATO and I'm pro-this and I'm pro-that, when he was happy not to be under a previous leadership.
Zara?
I think it's quite embarrassing when Rishi Sunak keeps bringing up Jeremy Corbyn's name. The reason being is it seems quite obvious that they are devoid of any kind of ideas and policies that would actually excite the public or win them over, and the polls show that. So keep bringing Jeremy seems to be the policy or the plan, and it isn't obviously working, but that doesn't mean that they're going to stop.
I mean, would you be advising this, Anita, if you were working for a government minister or Rishi Sunak in terms of Labour's 20 points ahead consistently?
Well, I think there's more nuance in this approach than is being recognised. And I think the reality of the situation is that actually voters don't know who Keir is, and they don't understand Keir. They don't know what he stands for, and they see him as defined in opposition. So effectively, he kind of just doesn't like whatever the government's doing. So when Zara talks about being devoid of ideas, I smiled because I thought she was referring to the Labour Party.
So right.
And I think that actually the fact that they don't know who he is means that they're casting around for what is he like? Who does he remind me of? And he certainly doesn't remind the voters of Blair, right? This is not a 1997 moment. And so the last leader was Corbyn. He supported Corbyn. So Keir, is he a bit like Corbyn? And I think there is a big weakness here that Labour is failing to recognise, in that their leader has no identity and people don't know what he believes and they don't know his vision. And I think that is a bruise that Rishi can keep pressing on.
Aubrey?
I think really this device that's being used by Rishi Sunak is not so much one to be viewed by voters, but is really about getting the benches behind him roaring, because he knows the power of what it's like when you're Prime Minister and the benches behind you are sort of quite stilted, silent, not behind you. Using Jeremy Corbyn's name gives all the Conservatives the same sort of stick to hit, to sort of hit.
But does Keir Starmer need to be worried about the legacy of Jeremy Corbyn in the way Anita is sort of painting?
I think the Conservatives will probably bring it up the closer we get to the next general election. But don't forget that Jeremy Corbyn isn't in the Labour Party anymore, at least isn't in the PLP. He won't probably be allowed to stand again if he doesn't get the whip back. So at that point, Keir Starmer can say quite
win as an
specifically.
independent, for sure.
Well, just to correct Aubrey, he is a member of the Labour Party.
Yes, but he's not a Labour MP and he's sitting as an independent. Yes. Would you like to see him stand again as a Labour
Jeremy
MP?
is a Labour Party member. The local Labour Party in Islington North want him to be their candidate. They should be able to vote for him to be their candidate, and he should be able to run in Islington
Well,
North.
we talked to him yesterday, and he said he obviously wants to get back to be a Labour MP, but Keir Starmer has pretty well said the door is closed.
I think that's a shame, because the local Labour Party really want Jeremy, the local constituency really want Jeremy to be their MP, and we shouldn't be in this situation, and he should be able to run.
Right. I mean, Joe, he is still there. Joe Twyman, in terms of people knowing who Keir Starmer is, as Anita was saying, is that a bigger problem?
Well, to a degree. At the time of the last Conservative leadership battle, we ran questions asking people who they could identify if they passed various different people on the street, and it was Jeremy Corbyn who very slightly was just ahead of Keir Starmer for Labour, but his figures actually were round about the same figures that they were for Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak at that time. It is true to say that Keir Starmer has perhaps not had as much cut through as you would expect for an opposition leader by this time in their leadership. But the circumstances have been very unusual. And of course, for the first couple of years, really, that Keir Starmer was leader, the news was completely dominated by COVID. And so the opportunities for getting in front of the camera were rather limited. I think this year is really the year for both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer to get their policies across, to get their personalities across, and to say to the electorate, this is who I am and this is what I stand for. Because I would say any criticism of Keir Starmer, that he's not well known or that he doesn't have particularly clear policies, is equally true in the eyes of the voters for Rishi Sunak.
Right. I mean, would you agree that Keir Starmer's transformed the Labour Party, though, since Jeremy Corbyn, Bob?
Oh, he certainly moved it forward, and he's a decent enough character. I just don't think he's going to come across well in comparison to Rishi. But when it comes to the point, OK, I agree with Aubrey to the extent that actually this is about there's a bit of Westminster politics here about cheering up the backbenchers. The nearer we get to the next election, I think we're probably going to be moving away from just saying you're trying to remind people of Jeremy Corbyn's disastrous leadership. And I think there are going to be many more significant things that will be attacking the Labour Party over, such as the fact that they think they have difficulty defining what a woman is, such as the fact that they're going to be on the side of strikers and not people trying to earn a living. So I do think there are going to be much more salient points the closer we get to the election. So to that extent, I agree with what Aubrey's saying about the fact that this is to cheer up the backbenchers. And there's a certain element there. But it also, I think, niggles the Labour.
Well, let Zara respond, particularly on the policies that were just listed there by Bob.
Well, if we look before 2019, which was a polarising election around Brexit, if we look at 2017, the policies that the Labour Party had, well, we won our biggest vote share since 1945 and deprived the Tories of a majority. Those were policies that are still popular today. Pay rises for key workers and public sector workers, nationalising our utilities, bringing back Royal Mail into public ownership. All of those policies are still very, very popular.
But a lot of them, Keir Starmer is not going to propose in the next manifesto. I mean, we can see that. I know you hope he does, but The Guardian says here Keir Starmer and Labour left to face off over manifesto plans. You mentioned a few of the proposals, like nationalising utilities, the abolition of tuition fees and a wealth tax. Are you prepared to do battle with Keir Starmer over these issues?
It's my job as a Labour MP to advocate for those policies that I believe in, so absolutely, making the case is what I will do.
I mean, Aubrey, are they going to have a chance, people like Zara, of persuading Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to retain some of these policies?
Well, it's quite interesting what Joe was talking about in terms of voters not exactly knowing what Keir Starmer is and what he stands for. And that can be a benefit as well, because it's helpful for him to be able to pivot to sort of fill things close to the election. He can't be boxed in and sort of say, well, you said this in the past. That is, of course, different when you compare what he pledged during the leadership campaign. And that's where the Conservatives and some sort of people on the Labour left are keenest to draw the biggest parallels between what he said then and what he's saying now.
Absolutely no way. I'm so sorry, Aubrey. Like, the reality of the situation is voting for a party that haven't been in power for a long time is a gamble. Yeah. And what you want to do is mitigate that risk as much as possible. Well, and you going in as someone who said one thing during the leadership contest, is now doing a different thing, is battling with Zaras of the world about whether or not they're going to nationalise, that is the thing that makes voters nervous. And if the economy is not in a strong position, then I think you get into a situation that could be very gnarly. On Rishi, you're Prime Minister, you have many more opportunities to make an impression with the public than leader of the opposition. So I think Keir Starmer should be far more nervous about what focus groups are saying right now.
Hang on, Aubrey, what were you going to say about Rishi Sunak?
I was just going to say that Rishi Sunak himself, during the summer leadership campaign, has also pivoted to drop a lot of the pledges that he made. So it's not as though it's something that voters can't stand and abhor. I'm just saying that there is space over the next 2 years for Labour to be able to pivot into sort of ground wherever they want to.
Yeah, but Aubrey, you've actually got to agree on policies, and that is still a fundamental problem for the Labour Party.
Yeah,
that you have a left say, we don't want to go down this route. The Conservative Party has changed their policies when it comes to issues like tax since Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak.
The voters understand the context has changed. Yeah. Voters understand what happened with the Truss government, and they see Rishi Sunak as cleaning up a lot of the things that happened as a result of Truss's leadership. So well, I think they're quite mature.
Well, as Anita mentions, the clean-up process, as she calls it, of Rishi Sunak following Liz Truss. Joe Twyman, this headline I'm just showing everybody in the Times: Tories can win if the whole party is hungry for it. This was written by former Conservative Party leader William Hague. Do you agree with that? Or do you think actually there is a case of mass fatigue with the Conservative Party and actually a malaise amongst Tory MPs who would like to see tax cuts?
Well, if the last 8 years have taught us anything in British politics, it's that anything can happen. And so can the Conservatives win at the next election? Yes, they can. If you look at in historical terms, the swing that would be needed by Labour at the next election is up there with 1997. And that size of swing is not achieved very often. And also there's issues with Scotland and Labour not being able to win as many seats there as they did in 97. So by historical terms, it is quite a task still ahead of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. But having said that, it's never been the case that a party has come from behind on leadership ratings and from behind on who's best on the economy to win the most seats at a general election. And at the moment, the Conservatives are behind on both by some distance. And also, it appears at the moment that the more people find out about Rishi Sunak, the more that he is exposed to the electorate, the less they like him. His ratings are starting to fall, and that's a problem for the Conservatives as well. But I think what we will hear more of is what we heard from Bob Seeley just a few moments ago, which is attacks on things that could be divisive for Labour. And so trans rights is an example of the kind of subject that Labour could, if you like, grab defeat from the jaws of victory over by having a massive internal argument that uses up a lot of their time and resources and makes them come across to the general public as out of touch, as divided, and as not ready for government. And so I think we can see the Conservatives, I think we will see the Conservatives over the next few months attempting to change the very poor economic expectations that people have at the moment in the hope of improving that, and at the same time trying to exploit divisions within Labour.
Joe Twyman from Delta Poll, thank you very much. You were wanting to come in. I wanted to put a general question to you, which you can
do you want to
answer,
do the question first?
Which is it 92 or 97? Because William Hague, I think, in that article talks about 92, John Major's victory, when it seemed that Labour were a shoo-in at the time under Neil Kinnock. What do you think?
Well, it's obviously a very binary way to present a very wide range of options, because anything could happen, couldn't it? I mean, I'd say it's much harder to sort of wrestle back the mantles for competence of economic stewardship, for example, of the economy, that the Conservatives have managed to kind of trash over the last few months and are slowly trying to work their way back to reclaiming, that is going to take a very long time, and voters aren't going to be prepared to forgive that in the short term.
For this year, this is going to be sort of attritional politics, and this year is absolutely critical. And if we haven't made up that progress by the end of the year, early next year, then for sure, then it will start to look bad. I have a lot of confidence in Rishi to do the job. I have a lot of confidence, sadly, in the inability of Labour to come up with a winning strategy. They won't have answers on boats. They are arguing amongst themselves over the NHS. They can't define a woman. They're on the side of the union bosses. We have huge opportunity. One other thing. Rishi was down in Shanklin in my Conservative club. He knew he was losing last summer. He worked his backside off going around that room and literally had 150 selfies, and he worked absolutely that room, and I've never known somebody to be so determined despite all the odds against him. So he will keep going.
Well, I don't think selfies are going to help the Tories get into power. I think what we need are pay rises in the public sector. We need investment in our NHS. We need to address these issues that mean that we have more food banks than McDonald's restaurants, and we have, you know, a record number of billionaires at the same time. There's gross inequality in this country, and this government that's been in power for 13 years is suddenly now waking up to smell the coffee, saying, oh, yeah, there are all of these issues. Well, yeah, you've presided over them, so I think it's about a government that's going to address those issues.
Right, let me get Anita in because I want to move on and talk about Dominic Raab in just a moment. 92 or 97?
I think that, I mean, I've said it, Keir Starmer is not Tony Blair, so I think the 97 there was a lot of positive decisions and a positive sense in the country of choosing Labour as opposed to rejecting the Conservatives, and I don't think we're quite seeing that dynamic. And I think, to Zara's point about the economy, I think there are really tough choices in the economy, and the public are not going to put up with easy solutions, so I do think there is a real concern that if Labour says, vote for us and everything will be amazing, voters will go, we're going through a tough economic time, do we really want to pay and have significantly higher taxes in order to get the kinds of things that Zara is saying will be possible?
All right.
So I think there's a lot to play for still.
5 minutes until Prime Minister's questions. We can go into the chamber and see if it is filling up or not as questions are being taken. Yes, it is. And, of course, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer will be facing each other with questions, no doubt a lot of them about the economy. Peter Barnes, my colleague from the BBC Political Research Unit, will be on standby, listening for any facts that need more investigation or probing. We'll be speaking to him afterwards. Before we get to Prime Minister's questions, let me just show you this headline in The Times. Number 10 was warned of Dominic Raab, Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, issues of his behaviour before Rishi Sunak promoted him. Does that worry you, Bob Seeley? There are these allegations, I think 24 or so complaints and allegations about bullying. Rishi Sunak is said to have known that there were issues around that. Should he have appointed him?
I don't know what the situation is because I'm not inside Downing Street. I can only talk about what I see from Dominic Raab, which is a highly professional, decent, competent person, who's a lot of whom has brought in some great ideas, whether it's Magnitsky Act, fighting, Russian criminality.
But this is his treatment of junior staff. This is his treatment of colleagues and officials.
Okay.
Should he be asked to step aside while this investigation is going in the way that...
I just think you've got to respect... I think you've got to respect due process. And my own dealings with Dominic, as a junior colleague of his, actually I found him very unbullying, very decent to work with, and someone who behaves with integrity. And I hope that comes out in the report.
Sadly, I hear stories of the power dynamics in Westminster play out like this, so I'm not surprised, but it is incredibly worrying, and I think it needs to be taken seriously. And one of the first things that Rishi Sunak could do is tell him to step aside while this is being properly investigated. But, the Tories have had several high-profile secretaries of state being investigated for bullying. We saw Priti Patel's investigation. So all of these claims have to be taken absolutely seriously.
Why isn't he taking decisive action, which is what he's being asked to do by Labour and the unions, in terms of Dominic Raab?
Well, Rishi Sunak obviously just wants to ensure that there's a process in place. The problem is this has been dragging on for quite a long time. In the case of Nadhim Zahawi,
it was quick.
That review was very, very quick, whereas with this instance, it seems there isn't yet an end point, and there seem to be more and more people coming forward to make these complaints as well.
We have to follow some kind of due process. You can't just hang people
is that the reason? Is he using it as cover?
At the end of the day, it will be a political decision that Rishi Sunak has to take. People can present the facts in front of him all they like, and you could argue that and as the Times was reporting, there were specific sort of informal warnings made to various people. Whether or not that was directly Rishi Sunak, we don't know. But at the end of the day, it will be a political decision for Rishi Sunak.
Just briefly.
Yeah, but you can't make a decision unless you know all the facts. And I think it's a slightly different process because the Cabinet Office is investigating. I should say I've worked with Dominic when I was in the Ministry of Justice. He was a junior minister. I didn't see these kinds of instances. So I think it is really important that every complaint is looked into properly. 24 of them takes a little bit of time. And so I think we should wait to see what happens. And I think Sunak being committed to that is a good thing for the party.
Sure. Just briefly to move on to Ukraine, because Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, was talking to Fox News. Let's have a listen.
Every time we've said that it would be a mistake to give such and such an item of weaponry, we end up doing it, and it ends up being the right thing for Ukraine. I remember being told that it was the wrong idea to give them the anti-tank shoulder-launched missiles. Actually, they were indispensable, and the United States, under Donald Trump, gave them the Javelins as well. They were indispensable.
Do you think the UK should send fighter planes, Bob?
I wish Boris, when he was Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, had actually armed the Ukrainians then. It was great that we armed them. What a shame that we only did it 3 weeks beforehand, because a lot of us were calling it before then. When it comes to fighters, probably not at the moment, because, again, it's a little bit too escalatory for the moment. And secondly, it's going to take 6 months to train the folks up on them. Much better, we make sure that the Ukrainians get the infantry fighting vehicles and the tanks, the artillery systems and the air defence, and we should focus on getting that right.
Let's go for Prime Minister's questions.
When you're ready, Mr Davis, we'll start. Kirsty Blackman.
Here. Question 1, Mr Speaker.
Here. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I know the whole House will want to join me in sending condolences to the First Minister of Wales on the death of his wife, Claire. I know from the warmth of the tributes made how much she will be missed. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Kirsty Black. Here.
As the Prime Minister reaches 100 days in office this week, having pledged a government... Having pledged a government marked by integrity, what are his thoughts on the UK being one of only 5 countries, along with Oman, Azerbaijan, Myanmar and Qatar, that has seen a decrease in Transparency International's corruption index score since last year?
Well, Mr Speaker, in fact, there's widespread recognition and support for the UK's approach to transparency and indeed tackling corruption. Indeed, the most recent report from the FATF body commended the UK for the steps that it had taken.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer to my entry in the Register of Interests. Arts Council England was established to increase access to great art for the population. There's real concern and anger that their current funding decisions do the exactly reverse of that on the basis of inadequate evidence and a lack of transparency in the process. Will my right honourable friend meet with me and other concerned members to discuss the situation in which centres of national excellence like English National Opera are at risk of closure and discuss a way in which we can reform the operations of Arts Council, which many people no longer feel is fit for purpose?
Well, Mr Speaker, I know that this is an issue that my honourable friend deeply cares about. He will know that decisions made by the Arts Council are taken at arm's length from government. DCMS ministers have been assured that that process was robust, but I will ensure that he gets a meeting with a relevant minister to discuss this important matter further.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his words about the First Minister of Wales and the sad loss of his wife? Everybody, I think, knows just how close they were, and I know that he's absolutely devastated by her loss at the weekend. Mr Speaker, when the Prime Minister briefly emerged from his hibernation at the weekend, he raised more questions than answers. So, in the interests of integrity and accountability, can he set the record straight? Did his now former chair tell government officials that he was under investigation by the taxman before or after the Prime Minister appointed him?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I appointed the independent adviser to investigate this matter fully. He has set out his findings in detail over the weekend, and on receipt of those findings, I took action, and I'd refer the honourable gentleman to the independent advisor's report.
Keir Starmer.
Oh, come on. Anyone picking up a newspaper in July last year would have known that HMRC and the National Crime Agency were investigating months before he appointed him. Mr. Speaker, The Independent, 6th of July, new Chancellor's finances secretly investigated by the National Crime Agency. The Observer, 3 days later, 9th of July, revealed officials raised flag over tax affairs before he was appointed Chancellor. The Financial Times, the next day, 10th of July, pressure bills to explain his finances. Is he saying his officials hid this information from him, or was he just too incurious to ask any questions?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before at the dispatch box, the usual appointments process was followed with respect to the Minister without portfolio. No issues were raised with me at the time of his appointment, but as the independent advisor's report makes clear, there was a serious breach of the ministerial code, and that's why I took decisive action on receipt of that report.
Keir Starmer.
So, in relation to his former chair, his defence is, nobody told me, I didn't know, I didn't ask any questions. Is the Prime Minister now also going to claim that he was the...
Order, Prime Minister. Mr Gullis, we heard enough last week. I can't hear what you're saying. I might not be able to hear what you're saying, but I can certainly see your mouth moving. It'll be moving outside if it continues. Prime Minister.
So for his former chair, nobody told me, I didn't know, I didn't ask any questions. Is the Prime Minister now also going to claim that he's the only person completely unaware of serious allegations of bullying against the Deputy Prime Minister before he appointed him?
Prime Minister.
So, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman asked these questions about what was known, and I followed due process. I appointed an independent adviser as soon as I was made aware of new information. The independent advisers conducted this process. But if he is so concerned about what people are saying and is so concerned about behaviour in public life, then recently one of his own MPs was forced to speak out because being in his party had reminded her of being in an abusive relationship. And then his own office was caught undermining her. He ought to be supporting her and her colleagues, but if he can't be trusted to stand up for the women in his party, he can't be trusted to stand up for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, at the last count, the Deputy Prime Minister was facing 24 separate allegations of bullying. According to recent reports, some of the complainants were physically sick. One says they were left suicidal. How would he feel if one of his friends or relatives was being forced to work for a bully simply because the man at the top was too weak to do anything about it?
Mr. Speaker, I noticed he didn't say anything about why one of his own MPs describes being in his own party. And Mr. Nipper, when I was made aware of formal complaints, I instructed a leading independent KC to conduct an investigation because I take action when these things happen. But what did he say at the weekend? He said at the weekend that hate had been allowed to spread unchallenged in the Labour Party under his predecessor. He was speaking as if he wasn't even there. But he was sitting right next to him, supporting him for 4 long years, not challenging. And it is typical of him, Mr. Speaker, declining to lead, sitting on the fence, carping from the sidelines, and never standing up for a principle that matters.
I want to hear both sides, and I'm not going to be interrupted by either side. And I'm particularly looking for people who want to continue this, because we will sort it out today. Keir Starmer.
Speaker, he's just like one of his predecessors who treated questions about conduct as something to brush off, who thought that ducking responsibility was a perfectly reasonable response for a Prime Minister. At least in fairness, his predecessor didn't go around pretending he was a paragon of integrity and accountability. But on that subject, was it a coincidence that the two people who arranged an £800,000 line of credit for the former Prime Minister were both shortlisted for plum jobs at the BBC and the British Council?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we addressed previously, the appointments process for the BBC chairman is rigorous, it's transparent, it's set out in a public code of conduct, and indeed was fully supported not just by an expert panel members, but also by the cross-party DCMS Select Committee, including where Labour members described the appointment as impressive. But Mr. Speaker, back this week in terms of what is actually happening to the people of this country, he voted this week with the unions to oppose minimum safety levels. He voted with Just Stop Oil to water down the public order bill. And what do the unions and Just Stop Oil have in common? They bankroll him and his party, Mr. Speaker. So while he sides with extremist protesters and union bosses, we stand up for hard-working Britons and school children.
After 13 years in power, trying to blame the Labour Party for his failure to sort out the strikes it's rank pathetic. The Tory party's addiction to sleaze and scandal has done huge damage to this country, and the cost to the public keeps adding up. We've got a justice system letting murderers walk the streets, heart attack victims waiting hours for an ambulance, an economy that's shrinking quicker than his leadership. And even I couldn't quite believe it when I saw that his government is expecting taxpayers to pay the legal fees for the member for Uxbridge defending himself over his lockdown rule breaking. £250,000. Surely even this Prime Minister can put his foot down, stand up to his old boss and tell him he made the mess, he can pick up the bill.
Mr. Speaker, he can't stand up to his union bosses. He can't stand up for Britain's school children today. And he can't stand up for the women in his party, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on, we're halving inflation, we're growing the economy, we're reducing debt, we're cutting waiting lists, and we're stopping the boat. While he can't even figure out what he believes in, we'll keep delivering for Britain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the integrated care boards must prioritise more access to new GP services, especially in places like South Derbyshire, where new housing estates are being built at the fastest rate in England, and in particular on the new brownfield development of Drakelow?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to increasing the number of doctors in general practice, and last year saw the highest ever number of doctors accept a GP training place. The BMA are consulted each year on the funding of GP services, and my honourable friend will know that the NHS has a statutory duty to ensure sufficient medical services, including general practice, in each local area.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pass on my condolences and indeed those of my party to the First Minister of Wales and also to the family, friends and colleagues of firefighter Barry Martin, who so sadly lost his life following the blaze in Edinburgh just last week. Mr. Speaker, we've just marked the 3-year anniversary of Brexit, and we've learned... They'll not be cheering in a moment, Mr. Speaker, because we have learned three things. The UK's trade deficit has grown. The economy is being hit to the tune of £100 billion each year, and of course, we know that the UK's economy is expected to be the worst performing of all advanced nations. Does the Prime Minister still believe that the UK can afford not to be in the European Union?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if you actually look at it, since Brexit, the UK has grown exactly the same as Germany has, Mr. Speaker. But not only that, we are taking advantage of Brexit to deliver for the people across the UK, whether it's the fishing and farming communities of Scotland, whether it's through the 2 new free ports that we've just announced. But, Mr. Speaker, the difference between his party and ours is that we respect referendums.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. Taken together, 2022 and 2023 are expected to be the worst years for living standards since the 1930s, and the economy is expected to perform worse than sanction-hit Russia. So as the Brexit ship sinks, with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition at the helm, does he blame those Scots who want to jump aboard the independence lifeboat?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the number one factor that is impacting people's living standards, inflation caused by high energy prices as a result of a war in Ukraine, Mr. Speaker. It's got nothing to do with Brexit, and that's why the government is taking significant action, supporting every family with £900 this winter. But what I would say to him is, rather than obsess about constitutional arrangements, focus on delivering for the people of Scotland. That's what we will do.
David Johnson.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The baby daughter of my constituents, Gary and Sarah Andrews, died just 23 minutes after she was born. When they asked questions about that, the parents were told that these things happen, and that if they had to listen to the concerns of every mother, they would be overrun. Thanks to dogged campaigning by Gary and Sarah and other parents whose babies had died avoidably, Nottingham University Hospital's trust was found to have systemic failures, and last week was given the highest fine that's ever been given for failings in maternity care. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this case, this situation, has to serve not just as a watershed moment for having the highest standards of maternity care, but also that when things do go wrong in something like an NHS trust or another public body, they have to be open and honest and transparent about their failings so that people can get the truth and not have it hidden from them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the tragic case that my honourable friend raises, and I know the whole House will join me in sending our thoughts to Gary and Sarah. We want to make sure that the NHS is the best and safest place in the world to give birth, and the NHS has taken steps to improve, but cases such as the one that my honourable friend raises highlight that more must be done. Nottingham University Trust is receiving support from the expert maternity improvement advisors, and nationally the Royal College is implementing the recommendations from the independent Ockenden report, together with £127 million of extra investment. But my honourable friend is absolutely right. When situations like this do arise, transparency is paramount so we can seek answers and make improvements.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's nearly 10 years since the tragic death of 9-year-old Ella Roberta, the first person ever to have air pollution listed on her death certificate. Yesterday's Environmental Improvement Plan pledges to improve air quality, but the government's targets are for 2040. That's a whole generation away. I don't think that's fast enough, and neither does Ella's mum, Rosamond Adu Kisi-Deborah. So on her mum's behalf, will the Prime Minister agree to meet us both to discuss the life-saving measures in a new proposed bill called Ella's Law?
Mr. Speaker, it's obviously very sad to hear the case of Ella, and our thoughts and hearts go out to her family. With regard to the legislation, as my honourable friend the Environment Secretary will be making a statement later today, we are confident that the measures we are putting in place are not only legally binding, but also world-leading in tackling air quality. The record over the past 10 years is one where every single air particulate has been reduced, with binding targets to continue reducing them in future, and indeed the Environment Act makes sure that we have the capability, accountability and ambition we need to make all the effective interventions to drive down air pollution.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Compared to what some people seem to believe, 82% of the jobs in our economy are in the private sector. compared to 18% in the public sector. Most of those private sector jobs will be in small businesses, the small businesses that we will depend upon for wealth creation and prosperity in the future. Will my right honourable friend consider bringing in a small business test across government so that every regulation we produce, every bit of legislation we produce will help, not hinder, small businesses? And does he share my ambition that every white van man and woman and every white coat tech worker in this country will regard the Conservative Party as their natural champions?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and this government is proud to join with him in supporting small businesses. I'm pleased to tell my honourable friend that we do have a small business test to consider whether the impacts of regulatory changes will disproportionately affect small and micro businesses. I will make sure that we are applying that test rigorously, and he'll be pleased to know that many small businesses will benefit from billions of pounds in business rates reductions this coming financial year, as well as our annual investment allowance, which at £1 million is the most generous tax incentive for investment for small businesses anywhere in the world.
And McLaughlin.
Mr Speaker, this morning, just 2 hours ago, I launched the APPG on prepayment meters. I did so because most people on these meters are on very low incomes, and yet they pay more per unit of energy than the Prime Minister does. They pay higher daily standing charges than the Prime Minister. They're automatically disconnected from their energy supply the second they run out of money. And perversely, right now, record numbers of people are being forced onto them by the energy companies. Can the Prime Minister even begin to imagine how terrifying that moment is when the lights go out and everything shuts down? And will he agree with me, rather than reading out, please, what he's got written in front of him, will he just agree with me that what I've just described is completely unfair?
Well, Mr Speaker, the government does recognise the challenges facing those on prepayment meters, and that's why the government is taking action. The Secretary of State has set out 5 very specific points on prepayment meters, energy suppliers being spoken to make sure that they treat customers with the respect and flexibility that they deserve. And finally, Ofgem have announced that they are launching a review into supplier practices in relation to prepayment meters. But all of this, Mr Speaker, comes on top of the considerable financial support that this government has provided to help people with their energy bills, with more of that support being targeted at the most vulnerable families in our society.
McLean.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. After 8,000 residents of Redditch signed my petition to bring back chemotherapy to the Alex, the Trust reversed their decision to leave it at Kidderminster permanently. A fantastic win for our town. And I'm grateful to the local acute trust for listening so carefully and changing their mind. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's right that the acute trust can change its mind on the provision of maternity and paediatric services so that women can give birth in our wonderful town of Redditch?
Well, Mr Speaker, my honourable friend has clearly been a fantastic advocate for the Alex and for her constituents. We have awarded £10.5 million to the local trust, and I understand that some of that funding is being used to improve maternity and paediatric services at the nearby Worcestershire Royal. My honourable friend will know that these operational decisions are being made by integrated care boards, and I know that she will continue to make her views known.
Andrew Gwynn.
Mr Speaker, if I had £1 for every time I'd heard the Prime Minister's weak excuses, I'd be able to pay the former Chancellor's tax bill. Because it was last July that it was reported that the National Crime Agency had investigated the Right Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon. The then Prime Minister knew. The media knew. We all knew. It's inconceivable that the current Prime Minister didn't know. So why did he choose to ignore it? That's right.
Mr Speaker, I appointed an independent adviser to fully examine the matter, establish facts and report back. That's the process that the party opposite called for. That's the process that we followed.
John Penrose.
Mr Speaker, 2 years ago the Prime Minister commissioned me to propose 30 ways to boost growth and make Britain the most competitive country in the world. So far we're underway with about half of them. But some of the most valuable, like reforming ponderous and expensive utilities regulators or building on our international lead in open banking, haven't moved at all. So will he meet with me to discuss how to channel our inner Nigel Lawsons and unblock the arteries of our economy with low-cost, pro-competition, supply-side reforms?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has a long track record in advocating for and implementing policies that increase our competitiveness and reform the supply side of our economy. His report was fantastic, and I look forward to meeting with him to discuss them further and help drive growth in this country.
Catherine West.
Mr. Speaker, ambulance waiting times are out of control. My constituent contacted me regarding her 93-year-old mother who lay collapsed on the ground at home for 17 hours and then queued for 13 hours to get into the hospital. And yet on Monday, the Prime Minister said he had his fingers crossed that ambulance waiting times would be reduced. Does he really think that's enough?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable lady actually looked, we published on Monday a comprehensive plan to reduce wait times in A&E and with ambulances, backed with more funding and reform of the system, more beds, more ambulances, more staff. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, it was a plan that was warmly welcomed by all of those working in emergency care and the ambulance services. They recognise that this plan will deliver reduced waiting times and improve care across the country, including in Labour-run Wales, where there are some things we can benefit them from.
Jerome Mayo. Mr. Speaker, if you grow up in Norfolk and you want to be a dentist, the nearest place you can train is in Birmingham or in London. So it's not really surprising, is it, that in Norfolk we have a dearth of dentists, whether it's NHS or private. We also know that where there is a dental training school, more dentists end up working locally. So will my right honourable friend agree to look again at the benefits of establishing a dental training school alongside the excellent medical school at the University of East Anglia?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend will know that there are around 400 dentists with NHS activity in Norfolk and Waveney. But he's right, the Centres of Dental Development build on the existing local infrastructure to help retain and recruit dentists. And I would advise him to encourage his local integrated care board to look at proposals for one of those centres in his area.
Mary Kelly Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister once said that he didn't have any working class friends. So we may not be aware that today 500,000 hard-working people are on strike, including in his own constituency. Tory Britain isn't working. Is the Prime Minister going to get a grip and negotiate with working people, or does he intend being remembered as the PM who silenced and sacked hard-working nurses, paramedics, teachers, rail workers and firefighters in a cost-of-living crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to teachers, we've actually given teachers the highest pay rise in 30 years. It includes a 9% pay rise for newly qualified teachers and record investment in their training and development. I am clear that our children's education is precious and they deserve to be in school today being taught. And actually the party opposite would do well to say that the strikes are wrong and we should be backing our school children.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, suicide is the biggest killer of young people under 35 in the UK. My constituent, Andy Airy, along with Tim Owen and Mike Palmer, are the three dads walking. Andy, Tim and Mike each tragically lost their precious daughters, Sophie, Emily and Beth, to suicide, and have campaigned tirelessly through charity walking for suicide awareness and prevention to be included in the school curriculum. I've been humbled to support them, including joining them on their UK walk as they came through Penrith, with their petition, which is due for parliamentary debate on the 13th of March, and with my early day motion, which has support from right across the House. Would the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to the three dads? And would he meet with me and the three dads to discuss suicide prevention and ultimately save young lives in the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course I pay tribute to Andy, Tim and Mike. especially for channeling their own personal tragedies into such positive action to prevent this happening to other families. That is inspiring and they deserve enormous credit. The government is taking action to improve the provision of mental health services for young people in schools and colleges, but I would be delighted to meet with him and Andy, Mike and Tim to discuss what more we can do.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that welcome. Ordinary people didn't need to hear an IMF forecast to understand that the UK economy is the worst performer amongst the leading nations in the world. They live with it every day. People know their energy bills are through the roof. They know that 750,000 households face defaulting on their mortgages while house prices fall. And they know that food prices are rising at a record rate of 16.7% as of today. The Prime Minister is 100 days in office, his party 13 years in power. In all that time, does the Prime Minister ever reflect that the only thing that the Tory party has been good at is pushing people into poverty?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, it is wonderful to hear from the right honourable gentleman, and I'd love to see him in his place. What I would say is that we're continuing to deliver for people across the UK, including and in Scotland. He mentioned poverty. Poverty today lower than when the Conservatives first came into office. Inequality lower than when the Conservatives first came into office. And the number of people in low pay, the lowest on record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today in my constituency there is a great sense of shock and disbelief following last night's horrific dog attack that killed a 4-year-old girl. The police investigation is still going on and it wouldn't be appropriate to speculate on the circumstances. But it would mean a great deal if, on behalf of the House, the Prime Minister could send our condolences to the family and to the community, and to thank the emergency services for dealing with the situation with their customary compassion and professionalism.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend and send my condolences, and I'm sure the whole House's condolences, to the girl's family and the community after this horrific incident. And I join him in thanking the emergency services. They have responded rapidly and professionally, and I know that my honourable friend himself will be supporting them and his constituents during this difficult time.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This past weekend... Can I blame the pain? Can I blame the painkillers, please? Apologies, Mr. Speaker, and thank you. This past weekend, I visited a charity which was hosting an exhibition in my constituency about metastatic breast cancer, which claims 31 lives each day in the United Kingdom. And the women there asked me to convey at the first opportunity to the government the need for more awareness, more support, more research and more drug availability. Can I ask the Prime Minister if he will do that, if he will help to bring that support? But also, I have written to the Scottish Government asking for their support. If in his next meetings with the First Minister he would mention it to her.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to the charity that the Honourable Lady mentioned and for the work they do? She's absolutely right. Awareness is key in tackling and identifying breast cancer symptoms early. One of the reasons why we're investing more in diagnostic and screening tools to make sure that we can detect more cancers earlier and treat them and ultimately save people's lives. I would be happy to pick up this particular topic with the First Minister when I next speak to her and ensure that we are working together to improve cancer services for everyone, regardless of where they live in the UK.
Charlie Spar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the United Kingdom government's negotiations with the EU regarding the Northern Ireland Protocol, would the Prime Minister kindly confirm to the House that the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and its 4 nations will not be compromised?
Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance. I know this is something that he cares passionately about. The implementation of the protocol is having an impact for communities in Northern Ireland. That's why it needs to be addressed, and that's what we are attempting to do through constructive dialogue. But the goal in that must be to ensure Northern Ireland's place in our precious union.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the election of the fascist Israeli government in December last year, there has been an increase in human rights violations against Palestinian civilians, including children. So can the Prime Minister tell us how he is challenging what Amnesty and other human rights organisations are referring to an apartheid state?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady also failed to mention the horrific attacks on civilians inside Israel as well. And it's important in this matter to remain calm and urge all sides to strive for peace. And that's very much what I will do as Prime Minister and in the conversations that I've had with the Israeli Prime Minister.
That brings us almost, I think, to the end of this session of Prime Minister's Questions. Let me introduce our guests for this part of the programme. For the Government, Claire Coutinho, Minister for Children, Thangam Debonair for Labour, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, and Nick Eardley, the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent. And, as I said, in a few minutes' time, we will be welcoming Mick Whelan, General Secretary of ASLEF, the Train Drivers' Union. Welcome to all of you, though, first of all. Lively exchanges, Nick, between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, deciding to focus his entire fire on the fate, to some extent, of first Nadeem Zahawi. What and when did the Prime Minister know about issues around his tax affairs? He has now been sacked. And the Deputy Prime Minister sitting there right next to Rishi Sunak and the 24 complaints of bullying that are being investigated. How successful do you think Keir Starmer was in trying to actually say this Prime Minister is weak?
Well, look, I think it's an issue that Rishi Sunak is struggling to get away from. And the problem I think he has at the moment is he is facing increasing questions about what he knew and when, about both the claims about Nadeem Zahawi and the claims that are being investigated about Dominic Raab. And you saw the Prime Minister try and turn this round. He's clearly not comfortable talking about it. He wants to try and defer to the independent advisor or to the KC who's looking in to Mr Raab just now. I did think the fact that Dominic Raab was sitting to his right was quite telling, because I'm sure Claire will tell us, a lot of Conservative MPs think that Dominic Raab's coat is on a sugary peg at the moment, that he's in a lot of trouble and that he may struggle to get through this. I was speaking to one minister just before PMQs who said the language here is going to tell us a lot. If the Prime Minister sounds really supportive of Mr Raab, maybe he's got a chance. The fact that the Deputy Prime Minister was right beside him suggests to me that maybe Mr Sunak is going to try and hold on to him. But the level of complaints that we know have now been made about Mr Raab are going to make that, I think, a bit of a tricky sell.
Claire, does Rishi Sunak need to explain what he did know about Nadeem Zahawi, the former party chairman, about his tax affairs and when, even though he's now gone, and Dominic Raab before he appointed both of them?
Well, look, he has with, in these cases. I think with Nadeem Zahawi, he said last week at PMQs, there was a new statement that came out with information. I think it was the week before that. He appointed his independent advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus, to go and look into it. That reported very quickly, and then he took swift action on it. So I think what you've seen from him the whole way through this is he's used, I think, a fair and due process of independent advisor to look into what's happened, and when the facts are established, he's taking action.
Right, so it's cover. It's cover for him, because he's not strong enough to actually make a decision himself about everything that was in the public domain, certainly about Nadeem Zahawi and, to some extent, Dominic Raab.
I would strongly push back on that. I think if you look at what's happened over the past 6 months, people said you must appoint an independent ethics advisor. And I think it's a bit rich for people then to complain when you use the independent ethics advisor to establish facts. You know, the PM is not himself a chief detective to go around fact-finding. I think it's quite right that you've got someone who's an independent advisor who can go and look at the facts, put it to him, and then he can take that decision, which he did very quickly.
What's wrong with that, Thangan?
Oh, goodness me. Well, I was one of the people who called for the independent ethics advisor, and the Prime Minister actually referred to that last week. Yes, of course, we needed an independent ethics advisor. We needed one last July, frankly, when Nadeem Zahawi was appointed, and then tried to sue a journalist for raising this very issue. It was in the public domain. Rishi Sunak did not have to wait for the report of the independent ethics advisor to sack his chair. The thing about Nadeem Zahawi was he was in charge of our money, our taxes, whilst he himself was in dispute with the taxman, and he tried to sue a journalist for pointing this fact out at the time. There was enough already there in the public domain for Rishi Sunak to sack him and continue with the ethics advisor's investigation. Prime Ministers sack ministers all the time without independent ethics advisors ruling. He could have easily done that and still had the independent ethics advisor's report.
Claire?
No, I mean, I disagree with that. I think what's happened is there was new information that he put out in a statement, and then that process took a couple of weeks. So to say I don't want to wait for time for the independent ethics advisor to look at things when it's been 2 weeks,
but are you
I think it's pretty.
Are you happy with the fact that
rich.
for the last 2 weeks this has been clouding your messaging? I mean, the government should be governing. It has been distracting for the government. It's also been distracting for whatever messaging you've been trying to get out over the last 2 weeks. Whatever you've been trying to announce, I don't know what it was, because it hasn't cut through, because that's all that's been on the news about the Tory government is the failure to sack Nadeem Zahawi, who was in charge of our money, in charge of our taxes, in charge of the tax office when he himself was in dispute with the tax office and didn't, it seems, be completely open and honest. Well, look, but Rishi Sunak didn't even answer any of those questions this morning.
Hang on, I would say, look, obviously the politically expedient thing to do would be to act immediately and things like
That'd
that.
be the right thing to do.
No, hang on a second. I actually think the right thing to do is to wait those 2 weeks to let someone independently assess the facts. I think most people in the public would accept that waiting 2 weeks for someone to put forward the facts so you can make a proper decision is actually the right thing to do.
No, it's weak.
That's what would happen. No, I'm sorry.
Weak.
I think that's actually quite strong. And I think that's what would happen in any professional organisation.
But it isn't any professional organisation. It's a government. It's a weak Prime Minister who must have known, because just because there is an appointments process in which information has to be declared, Nadeem Zahawi should have declared various pieces of information. I think it's very telling that Rishi Sunak didn't even have the strength to answer any of Keir Starmer's questions on that. It's a weak Prime Minister who failed to sack Nadeem Zahawi in good time. As a result, there's been a distraction from your government and there's been none of your announcements getting through to the public.
Claire, I think I'm right in saying that you were Rishi Sunak's PPS at the time that the first reports came out about Nadeem Zahawi's tax affairs. Were they looked into at all?
Well, I mean, so Nadeem, when he was Chancellor, obviously Rishi had resigned at that point, so I wasn't his PPS.
You were with Rishi Sunak when...
Well, I mean, he wasn't in government, so
When he was Chancellor was the first time that reports emerged about Nadeem Zahawi's tax affairs. I'm just wondering if anyone in government looked into it, had any sort of interest in the reports at the time?
So, I mean, I was mainly working on cost of living and things like that when I was working for Rishi Sunak. Those are the conversations that I was having in government as we were putting forward, you know, energy packages of support for people. So that's what I was focused on, and I didn't personally have any conversations with anyone.
Thangan, Rishi Sunak raised comments by the Labour MP, Rosie Duffield, in response to the claims being thrown at him by Keir Starmer about being weak over his ministers. Now, Rosie Duffield had likened her treatment in the Labour Party to an abusive relationship. Does Labour have a woman problem?
Absolutely not. I mean, Labour's the party that brought in the Equal Pay Act, Sex Discrimination Act, almost all the legislation on violence against women and girls. I was working in the violence against women and girls movement for 26 years up until I was elected as an MP. And in that time, I can tell you that the progress that we made under Labour governments was extraordinary. And what I also learnt in that time was what Keir Starmer was like. He was Director of Public Prosecutions while I was working at various violence against women and girls organisations, and I saw the leadership stance that he took. Now we have more than 50% of the Parliamentary Labour Party are women, and we are strong, vocal women. Up with nonsense we will not put.
No.
And we are really supportive of each other and of women across differences.
It must be extremely upsetting and uncomfortable for you, as one of the women that you have described, to have Rosie Duffield, your colleague, giving that pretty emotional interview, this in response to the debate about the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland, to which the government has decided to block, where she says, I feel now, after 6 years of being cold-shouldered by the Labour Party, these are her views being put forward in a gender-critical way, conjures memories of how I felt in that abusive relationship that she's talked about in the Commons.
I don't know why Rosie has chosen those words. I can't answer for Rosie, but I do know that the atmosphere in the Women's PLP is supportive. We work with each other, we listen to each other across difference, and that's the atmosphere that Keir has also led from the front on instilling in the entire Labour Party, that we try and work with difficult issues. Now, as I said, I don't know why Rosie's chosen to say that, and I feel for anyone who feels that way, but my experience of the Labour Party and the Women's PLP in particular is of a supportive, dynamic and confident environment and a confident group of women who are used to being able to give each other support and speak out against injustice and prejudice.
I mean, is she wrong, Rosie Duffield, in the way that she is expressing her views when it comes to the debate around transgender rights?
As I said, I don't know why Rosie's chosen to express her views. They must reflect her experience. My experience is that this has been, it's a difficult debate, it's a challenging debate, but the Labour Party is the party of equality. We passed the Gender Recognition Act in 2004. We also passed the Equality Act in 2010, one of the last pieces of legislation we passed, and we're really proud of those pieces of legislation, but that's part of a very long tradition of legislating and acting on violence against women and girls, on gender discrimination, on women's equality generally, and I'm really proud of that legacy and looking forward to what else we're going to do in government.
All right, it's time to introduce Mick Whelan. Hello to you, General Secretary of ASLEF, the Train Drivers Union. There are hundreds of thousands of people, as you know, on strike today, workers on strike. Your workers were offered a 4% pay rise for 2 years in a row. What's unacceptable about that?
Well, we'd agreed a framework and a labelling agreement to allow us to talk to a fractionalised industry, and somebody decided to go outside that process, put out a pay deal that wasn't a pay deal, that hadn't been part of the negotiations, that contained hundreds of red lines we'd already said no to, and decided to negotiate in bad faith through the press rather than talking to us. And then says, why won't you take it? And part of it was give up every agreement you've got nationally and locally that you've managed to gain through paying through productivity for the last 140 years, and we won't make you redundant until 2024. So I'm not surprised that we rejected it.
Are train drivers more deserving of a pay rise than other sectors who are striking today?
Nobody's more deserving of a pay rise. Everybody should have a pay rise.
Everybody?
Everybody should have a pay rise.
And what sort of a pay rise?
Something that puts a real dent in the cost of living crisis. And it's going to be difficult for anybody in the current economic climate, whether it be a Labour government or Conservative government. But our case, and I'll plead our case first if I might, is that we haven't had a pay rise for 4 years. During the pandemic, like other key workers, we went to work, we moved the food and medicine around the country and other key workers around, at a time when people were putting themselves at risk. And during that period of time, we didn't seek a pay rise. But as soon as cost of living started to hit 5.2%, then 8.2%, then 14% last year and 10% this year, we felt that we're deserving of a pay rise same as everybody else.
I'm just going to be showing pictures of striking workers. There you can see, marching through the capital, said to be the biggest strike in decades, day of strike action. Mick, just to put it into context, if your members accepted that 4% rise for 2 years in a row, the average driver salary would rise to £65,000 by the end of this year. Let's compare that to the average salary for a state school teacher, also on strike in England and Wales today, is £42,358.
And I would wish they had what we have, and I wish the fire brigade and other public sector workers have what we have. We didn't privatise the industry. We didn't create a dearth of resources, and we didn't create the recruitment and retention packages that drove our salaries. What we have done in the last 2.5 decades, though, is work within that system, and nobody actually gave us anything. We've given masses of productivity and flexibility during that period of time to achieve what we've got. I don't walk into a room and say, look, I'd like 10 grand this year, please can I have it now? And all of a sudden they hand it over to my negotiators or to my teams. The reality of where we are today is that every change in the railway, every major project, every new train is there because we've helped to get it there.
Claire?
Look, I think for most people in the country, they would look at people who are earning £65,000 right now and say they shouldn't be on strike. I mean, if you look at what's happened, and I've got a really high commuter constituency, you know, the passenger volume's down by 20%, so they've not recovered since the pandemic. The government's put in £31 billion to support the railways and keep them going. And I think most people would say, OK, if you're getting £65,000, I understand that cost of living is really hard and people are really struggling. Inflation is really, really difficult. But actually, asking the taxpayer to foot more of that bill, I think isn't particularly reasonable.
Do you agree with that, Thang?
Well, I just think it's laughable, actually, that someone who represents the government can actually look at the train industry at the moment and not recognise, A, the contribution that mixed members have been making to our daily lives, particularly when our lives were at risk.
So
and
why-
their lives
why
were
are you
even
on the
more at
picket
risk.
line with
But
them, then?
also, that Mixed Union actually warned the government years ago about the recruitment crisis, which was leading to catastrophic cancellations that have been affecting commuters for years. This isn't just about strikes, it's also about the way our train services are being run. And if you're really serious about protecting commuters, you could think about taking the contracts back about failing train companies like TransPennine Express, for example, who are not performing, who are failing commuters every day. Every single day.
Let's talk about those commuters, because lots of them are earning much less than £65,000.
So why are you letting
and they
them
can't,
down?
And they can't go to work. And frankly, I
So why are you letting them down?
would ask to Mick and others, what is your plan to get people back on the trains? Because that's the best way to get the pay rises that you want. And I would say striking and disrupting is not going to encourage people back.
Are you going to fix the train
Hang on,
services?
Let's get Mick to
Well, we
respond.
hardly rushed into it. It's taken us 4 years to get to that point. And we've been out on strike for the best part of a year. And we've refreshed all our mandates recently, as you know, Joe, where we got a higher turnout in December than we got in the previous ones. And they're running at 94 to 99% in favour of strike action short of strike.
Is it fair, though, that the earnings of the average train driver at £65,000 will far outstrip the average earning of working people?
No, it isn't. And we need to do something about that. And we need to do something about what people earn. And in a week in which we've just seen that food inflation has gone to 16.3%, we know that the energy price hasn't come back down in line with the cost of energy at this moment in time. We know that there's 4 million people possibly going to default their mortgage. We know there's 14 million people in poverty. We know there's 1.5 million destitution. We know we've got cities now with malnutrition after 12 years of a Tory government.
And how do you pay for it all?
Well, how we pay for it is that if we could have that awful Trustnomics weekend and waste £74 billion, if we can spend £38 billion on track and trace, many of the things that we can find money for, but we can't find it for. And let's talk about how income works, disposable income. You know, we look at economics and, strange enough, rich people don't spend their money, but ordinary people do.
But a lot of people will think train drivers are rich on £65,000.
Well, I tell you, when you give me 65,000, and if it's in your gift, Joe, that'd be great. But it was 4% and 4%, which is actually a 20% pay cut, right?
Right, but on the principle, when you talk about rich people, who are you talking about?
Well,
what sort of earnings are you talking about?
It was only 3 prime ministers ago, and it seems such a short time ago, that he was talking about high-skilled, high-paid workers, Mr Johnson. But then the only high-skilled, high-paid workers that we have in the country then apparently bankers who can have their salary cap and their bonus cap lifted, or directors.
Well, that doesn't cost the taxpayer.
But can also make another point, just for the public who may not quite understand the rail industry. We don't work for the government. We don't work for the DfT or the Treasury. We work for 15 private companies who are declaring profits and paying shareholder dividends. Is it not right then that the workers in those companies get some sort of share of that?
Nick?
Mick, the Chancellor seems to think that if he puts your members' pay up by inflation and education union members up by inflation and nurses and everyone else up by inflation, that will make inflation worse and it will bake in some of the challenges that the economy has just now. Do you accept that point?
I accept that, but also I accept the fact that
it would be inflationary to give those pay rises.
But let's put it into context then, shall we? So we've got massive rampant inflation at the moment, and the top 350 FTSE companies, their profitability went up by 73%. The workers didn't get a share of that. They didn't do that. Wage inflation currently isn't fueling inflation. But the counter-argument to those inflationary measures is that most of that money then comes back in direct and indirect taxation. So even at the lowest level, people pay 25% income tax. My people would pay 40%. Then you pay your national insurance, and then you pay VAT and all those other things. So you generate jobs, you generate for the local economy, and you actually get money out into the economy that gets people, strange enough, back on trains and into hospitality.
Would you like to see politicians like Thangham, Debonair on the picket line with your striking workers?
You know, I'm on record of saying that, so I won't mislead people. We've had over 160 Labour MPs on our picket line. Keir has chosen that the shadow cabinet shouldn't go on the picket line, and that's his decision.
Will you accept his invitation?
Well, as Mick said, Keir has said that the shadow cabinet, and I'll tell you why Keir wants us to stay focused on our jobs, is because the best thing we can do for working people, for trade unions, is to get into government and make sure that in that first 100 days, which we have pledged to do, is to bring forward our employment bill, which will give working people better rights, it will enhance trade union rights, it will help make it less likely that mixed members would have to go on strike in future. But I also invite Claire to have a look at the notice boards, the departures coming out of Leeds, coming out of Manchester Piccadilly on a non-strike day. Look how many trains are being being cancelled every single day, and your government's doing nothing about that. So if you really care about commuters, take back control of those contracts, sort out those train companies, and make sure that that's also something that you bake into your pronouncements about commuters.
Just briefly, Mick Whelan is on Labour's ruling National Executive. People will put, as Rishi Sunak suggested, that Mick Whelan is running or helping run the Labour Party.
But we have a democratic party, and we have representatives of our affiliates, including our trade union members. I'm a trade union member. It's right that we have that, but we're also fully accountable. We make transparent decisions, and we will have lively debates from time to time.
By Rishi Sunak.
I don't think so at all. I think a huge amount of the Labour Party, as Sangam has said, get funded by the unions. And I think actually, as politicians, we should look at all of our constituents, and we should make a fair, I think, a reasonable assessment. And I don't think it is fair and reasonable to say that if you're on £65,000, which, by the way, is a lot more than most of our constituents are on, that we completely support that the rest of the taxpayers who earn less than you should be putting more money than the £31 billion we just put in the last 2 years into paying extra salaries.
Right, and it's not just about pay, it's about working conditions, isn't it, Mick? I mean, are you ever going to accept changes or reforms on things like voluntary weekend working?
Right, so we went to 11 and 12-hour days under various what they call driver restructuring deals in the mid-90s. We went to minimum breaks. We did away with all the mileage allowances that made us more productive, and that was what generated our pay and where we are. The idea that we should be forced to work our days off, it has to be voluntary. Now, if somebody, if there's a rationale for it, well, nobody else in the country is forced to work their day off unless there's an economic reason for it, I imagine. But also, on top of it, we now can't have any commitment to overtime or Sundays or weekends.
Yeah, but trains do run at the weekends, don't they, and on a Sunday?
No, the real risk now with the new slavery bill and the indenture under the minimum safety levels is that we could also be forced to come in on our days off because we haven't seen the legislation yet.
Well, when you say being forced, you make it sound like you're almost sort of slaves in that sense, being forced to work on a Sunday. Trains run at the weekends. People do expect a train service on a Sunday. Why should it be kept as voluntary?
Well, we called and have called for the last 2 decades for all performance-driven services to be part of the working week. And we've got no problem with Sundays being part of the working week. It's our policy. What people don't want to do is to pay for the number of train drivers required to run a 7-day service, and then those that are there to work their time off. That's not the same thing.
Nick?
Mick, I've been speaking to government for weeks and weeks and weeks about how this is all brought to an end. Is there any prospect of a deal anytime soon? Because a lot of people at home will just want to know, are the trains going to get back to normal?
Well, strangely, if I'd like my life to get back to normal, I'd rather be coming on here and talking to you about the green agenda, electrification of the railways, moving mass passengers and mass freight, regenerating
agree to a deal, then.
Right, and we'll reach a deal when someone offers me one. Giving up every agreement you have, right, for a paltry 4% and 4%, right, isn't the solution. Doing that deal in public and operating in bad faith sets talks back. We are now back into talks next week with the industry, but we are further behind where we were than when we started 12 months ago because of the actions of the employers, right, supported by the government who did this to us. So if you want to talk about the bad actors in this, I can do that all day.
How long will this go on then?
It'll go on to my members say they've had enough.
So that could be all year?
Well, I hope to retire in 3 years.
Thanks for that. Well, that gives us something to work towards. Mick Whelan, thank you very much. We're going to move on to something that was raised at Prime Minister's questions, and this was about the economic cost of Brexit. 3 years on, yesterday, we were celebrating or commemorating, whichever way you want to look at it, Brexit 3 years on. Let's talk to Peter Barnes, who was looking at the figures that were brought up from our political research unit. Peter.
Yes, so this was a question raised by Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP in Westminster. And he said that, according to figures, Brexit is costing the UK economy £100 billion a year. And that's based on some analysis that came out yesterday from Bloomberg Economics. And he also pointed to the IMF report from yesterday, which suggested that the UK was going to be the slowest growing of the major economies this year. So compared to all of the other bigger countries in the world, we're going to have the worst economic performance this year, according to the IMF. Now, Rishi Sunak's response to that was to say that since Brexit, the UK economy has grown exactly the same amount as Germany. Now, I think he got this a little bit wrong. He was quoting something that his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has been saying, which is that since the referendum, so in 2016, the UK economy has performed approximately the same as Germany's. But actually, if you just go back to when Brexit happened 3 years ago, the UK economy has been a bit worse than Germany's. We know that the UK economy is the only G7 economy still smaller than before the pandemic. But I guess the big picture here is that both the UK and Germany have had pretty weak economies in recent years. And if the IMF is to be believed, the UK is going to be the worst country again this year. So it does raise a question of why the UK economy is so weak.
Yes.
So I've got a couple of questions for your panellists. For
good.
Claire, does she think that Brexit is helping the UK economy? Is it making it stronger? And for Thangham, does she agree with Stephen Flynn? And if so, should Labour's policy be that the UK should have a closer relationship with the EU?
Peter, thank you.
Well, so Peter, I would just pick you up on saying again, because last year we had one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, and I think you would agree that that was fair to say. And one of the reasons that we actually had that growth was because we could get the vaccine rollout quickly, and that means we could unlock quicker than other economies. That clearly has been a factor. And I think overall over the last 10 years, we've been one of the fastest growing economies in the G7, bar I think the US and Japan. So it's easy to pick out one year, and I know people like to do that and just laser in on that. But anyone who works in economics will like to look at a longer picture.
It's true that the IMF does say that UK had fairly good growth last year in 2022 and pretty good in 21. But to some extent, that's really because the effect of COVID on the UK economy, at least in the short term, was much more dramatic. We went into a much deeper dive in our economy than other countries.
I just wanted
so
to
the
pick you up on
bounce
that
back
one
has been
again,
higher.
though.
But the point is, our economy is still smaller than before
I'm
COVID.
going to have to
according
come in and give Thang a brief. Is Brexit the reason for the IMF saying we're going to fall behind?
Well, there's any number of reasons.
Yeah.
We've had actually,
But is it
contrary to
Brexit?
what Claire says, we've had low growth for 13 years. We've had low growth, low productivity, high taxation. If the economy had continued to grow after the Tories took over in 2010, at the average rate it was under the Labour government, we'd be £40 billion better off for public services.
Well, I think,
and individuals
we all remember the
would
Labour
have
government saying there is no money left.
average income
I
would
might
be
have to leave.
£11,000
I might have to
greater.
leave our guests continuing to argue this out. That's all we have time for. Bye bye.
God. Don't know, why is the UK economy so poo? I don't know. You crashed it, remember? Maybe that was a fucking, reason? You crashed the fucking economy? Remember? Does anybody remember Liz Truss was the Prime Minister? At all? I mean, hello? Just pointing out something that was fucking blatantly obvious. The economy's shit because we got the fucking Tories in power. They've literally destroyed Britain. It's comical and tragic at the same time. Tragic comedy. That's exactly what Great Britain is. And it always will be under the fucking Tories. I mean, people forget who Margaret fucking Thatcher is apparently. Fuck my life. Ugh, me split swear.